Today's video is brought to us by Firearms Legal Protection. Firearms Legal Protection is a legal defense program for lawful gun owners with a 24/7 emergency hotline and plans designed specifically for self-defenders. They are offering a discount on their plan to Ask fans, so hit the link in the description for that. If you have seen the recent officer-involved shooting in Tempe, Arizona, you know that it has caused an awful lot of controversy. And I asked Marc Victor to sit down with me and talk about this. Before we get started though, I really want to say how much I appreciate the folks at Firearms Legal Protection for starting this series that we call John's Briefs, for really being invested in educating all self-defenders in the United States about moral and legal self-defense. It's their support that lets me do stuff like this. I also want to say thanks to Marc Victor for donating his time and educating all of us. So let's hear from Marc and let's watch this video. Make sure you go hit the original and watch it, and then let's talk about some of the issues here in fleeing felon apprehension. So we're here with Marc Victor, and as always, Marc, I really appreciate you spending the time with us, especially on difficult topics like this. So, if you go watch the video, you have a Tempe PD officer, and he ends up shooting a fleeing burglar in the back who had a gun on him, and he shot at him twice as he's in full flight and running away. And so there's this big discussion about the reasonableness of whether or not it was reasonable for the officer to do what he did. And you've watched the video from what you see there, and I think you and I can both say what the video says isn't all the evidence. It's a perspective, but it's not all the evidence. And so, generally speaking, before we get into this particular case, when can an officer use deadly force in stopping a suspect?
Well, of course, an officer, like anybody else, can use deadly physical force when they are directly threatened with death or serious physical injury. If that threat is imminent, they have every right to defend themselves like everybody else. In addition to that, they can defend third parties. I don't know that that was the argument here.
Right.
But in addition to that, officers have this, as law enforcement, they have this other idea or notion that's permitted in the law that if we're dealing with a dangerous fleeing felon, the idea here is that because the guy's so dangerous and he's going out into the community, then an officer can use deadly physical force to stop a deadly fleeing felon. In this case, the specific case here, I think that, for starters, it's very, very important to say anytime we discuss these cases, we don't know everything, right?
This is going to be super fact sensitive.
Yes.
And the facts have to all be known, and everything always is. And we may have news stories, we may have even the badge cam, but we don't have the full disposition from the officer. We don't have a lot of information yet.
Well, I gotta say, even when you were introducing it and you said, well, he came to, he shot this burglar, blah, blah, blah. I don't know that this kid's a burglar, right? I mean, in fairness, we don't know. He's presumed innocent. All I saw was a video and a kid in a truck who got out and started running. So we don't know exactly what the call is. We don't know what was in the officer's head. We don't know if the officer is trying to say, look, the reason I shot this guy is because I think he turned and he presented an imminent threat to me, and I saw what I thought was a firearm, or if he's trying to say, well, I shot because I thought he was a dangerous fleeing felon. Either one of these is going to have questions, follow-up questions, right? Why did you think he was a dangerous fleeing felon? I mean, I don't know. Does this kid's description match something about the call? Was there other information on the call? What was the information? I got to tell you that, in a situation like this, you see that you're dealing with a kid, right? Admittedly, it looks like he's got something in his hands. As I understand it, it's not a real firearm, it's an airsoft.
Ended up being a BB gun.
He's got a BB gun in his hand, but look, you gotta be fair and reasonable to the officer, right? He can't tell, probably, in that instant whether he's dealing with a BB gun or he's dealing with a deadly firearm or something along those lines. So you have to allow a little bit of sort of reasonableness for a mistake in there as well, right?
Big point there. The officer is only required to be reasonable too.
Right.
They don't have to be perfect.
They don't have to be perfect. That's not the standard. The standard is, did he act reasonably? It may turn out that this guy may have been holding something that was completely unrelated to a firearm, but that maybe was reasonably perceived by the officer as a firearm. But I think what stinks about this one is it sure looks like he didn't have to shoot this guy. And it looks like you're dealing with a little kid, even if he's got a gun. What level of evidence do we have to suggest that the officer knew or at least believed that this guy was dangerous to the community? I don't know. Those are the kinds of things that I would want to know. If we've got somebody and, you know, he's a known, maybe he's got conviction on his record and we know he's a dangerous guy and these kinds of things, and now you see and you recognize him as this person. Here's somebody getting ready to flee into the community who we know is a danger. I think that's a different circumstance than we just got a phone call and there's an argument that there's a burglary there. I mean, a burglary is not necessarily a violent crime at all.
Right.
You don't have to be violent to commit a burglary. That he had a firearm, well, you know, it's Arizona, a lot of people have firearms, so I don't know if we got enough on this one to say. I think what people are upset about is the question of, look, we draw these lines, we make these rules, but it's really a continuum, right, of force.
Sure, 100%.
And in this case, I think what bothers us is, did he have to shoot this kid? Were there other, you know, could he have just dialed up on the radio, hey, here's what he looks like, he's running in this direction, block off the alley or something, or maybe even give chase. And so I think people are going to be understandably bothered by the fact it looks like this officer had other options, right?
Yeah, I think obviously here one of the things that I see that's going to stand out in the public's eye is that it turns out that this was a 14-year-old. And so in the public's perception, of course, well, he's just a kid. Okay, but on the other side, I go, yeah, but a 14-year-old kid running down the alleyway with a gun in his hand is a pretty serious issue. So there's this perspective. I think the other part, to be quite clear here in modern America, is that he's a person of color. And so that's a significant issue, even though the officer is a person of color as well. So that is a thing that plays in America today.
You know what? But it shouldn't.
I agree.
When I look at that video, I don't care, and it's irrelevant to me what color that cop is or what color the kid is. It doesn't change the analysis. It shouldn't change the analysis.
I'm just saying from a public perception perspective, it's definitely got.
This is a legal analysis. This isn't sort of a political analysis, and we need to keep the two separate. I mean, maybe it wasn't wise for the officer in a sort of political or a community relations sense to shoot this kid. But if the question is what's legally permitted, that's a completely different question. And also, we got to be very careful. We need to resist the urge to play Monday morning quarterback here. The issue isn't, oh, well, now we find out he's 14. Now we find out it wasn't a real firearm.
Right.
That's not the proper standard to use here. The standard is, what did the officer actually believe at the time, and what did he reasonably believe at the time? And then there are different sets of questions. There are civil liability questions here. Then there's the possibility of criminal liability, maybe for the officer. These are slightly different analysis. So, look, we're going to have to wait and see how the facts bear out. I could imagine facts that which would cause me to conclude this is a bad shooting. I could also imagine facts that would cause me to conclude that this is a good shooting.
And I think the question here, there's two things. Number one, the limits of video, right? I mean, the limitations, because we have the video from his badge cam, but his badge cam's not his eyes, and his eyes is not his brain. It's not what was he perceiving in the moment. What did he see in the moment? Why did he press the trigger? Why did he decide to shoot? And that could really color where this one ends up going. And then the other one that I see, and we talk about this on the channel all the time, I'm glad you brought it up, is that difference between can I, should I, and must I?
Yeah.
Because, you know, there's a reasonable question here that you say, wait a minute, can the officer shoot someone who's fleeing, who he reasonably perceives as danger to the community? That's pretty much the legal standard that exists today for law enforcement officers. But did he have to here, or were there other options? So that would be a problem of preclusion. He had other things he could have done that were maybe better in that moment.
Yeah, what makes these cases interesting to discuss, right, is because there's much gray here. Right? There's a lot of gray area. And so we pretend like we've got really clear lines here, but it's not really clear lines. Like when we talk about reasonableness, right? What's reasonable?
Who's reasonable?
Did the officer act reasonably? Okay, well that's important, right? Because if you act reasonably, then generally speaking, you acted in a legal way. If you acted unreasonably, you acted in an illegal way. But who's to really say what's reasonable and what's unreasonable? And it's not just what's reasonable, it's what's reasonable and unreasonable under all of the circumstances as perceived by that officer at the time. And what would a reasonable officer in the exact same circumstances do? And very hard to answer these questions.
Well, and from a criminal perspective, the prosecutor's looking at that, can I say beyond a reasonable doubt that this was unreasonable versus in a civil case, we're asking on a preponderance of the evidence.
And you have yet another concern here, which is maybe more of a political question. What types of cases is a prosecutor going to exercise his or her discretion to bring on behalf of the community, right? I mean, these are also, and their issue there that they use in terms of charging standards is really an answer to the question, what's the reasonable likelihood of a conviction here? They may say, look, we might think it's actually an illegal act, but we don't think we can get a conviction for one reason or another.
Right.
So they have issues that involve spending of resources in terms of whether we go after this person or not. So I can tell you this, this will be carefully reviewed, and the county attorney will look at it, and our history with this particular county attorney is that he's not afraid to charge police officers with crimes. We have many examples of that. If they determine that they think there's a criminal offense here, they'll bring it, and if they think there's not, they won't. And that's the different question than whether or not there might be civil liability for what the officer did.
So I think there's something interesting that you just said there, Mark. You have experience with the county attorney, and as a defense attorney, as somebody who goes to court a lot, you say that this particular Maricopa County, that no problems with charging cops with criminal acts.
Yeah, we have personal experience with that. That's right. I mean, I can't speak as much to past county attorneys or obviously future ones, but I can tell you Bill Montgomery, the current sitting Maricopa County attorney, is a guy who I've gotten to know over the years, and he and I have yet to find any issues on guns that we've disagreed on.
Okay.
We generally see eye to eye on these circumstances. I think he does a pretty good job in terms of charging decisions. I can tell you I've had clients, I had one just recently who police arrested and were investigating on a first-degree murder charge, and they decided not to bring the charge. It was probably the right answer.
Okay.
And so sometimes they bring them, sometimes they don't. You know, it's possible we may see things differently, but anybody who would say there's sort of a blanket policy to not charge police officers is just missing the boat here. They get charged, at least in this county, from what I've seen, during the time and appropriate times when they should get charged. And we've got cops in prison in this state who have acted inappropriately and who were charged with crimes and were convicted and sent to prison. So in the right circumstance, if properly charges ought to be brought here, I think they will be. I'm not saying I don't know if they should or shouldn't.
Well, that actually gives me personally a lot of peace, because if somebody who would kind of probably in many cases be seen as an adversary to the county attorney in places says no, he does the right thing in these particular instances, and there's no collusion here, there's no hate for the cops, but there's no buddy system. He does the right thing the right way in the right times. That helps me to say when the decision of the prosecutor's office comes out, okay, they did their due diligence and they did a good job. And sometimes that's why we got to just wait and recognize all the information is not going to get released to the public and to the places with the right people, with the right education, who have qualified opinions on these things. When they make a determination, we got to let them make that determination.
They're hard questions, and this may very well be a close one. And we just got to let them make the decision. I mean, in terms of people who think that there's sort of back channel things going on where somebody's making a call or paying money, that's just not our system. I'm not saying it never happens, but I've done criminal cases now 25 years, not only throughout Arizona, but many cases in other states, state courts, federal courts. I've not yet seen one case where I felt like there was some sort of corrupt activity or somebody was getting a better deal or a worse deal because of the color of their skin or their religion or ethnic background or sexual orientation or something like that. I just haven't seen it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it is not the prime mover in our justice system.
Awesome. Well, guys, wish I had an easy way to say on this one that we haven't, here's a cut and dried answer. But the reality is when we start looking at the criminal and civil aspects of these and the real life circumstances, sometimes they're not so easy. So Mark, I appreciate you bringing a nuanced and qualified perspective.
Thanks for having me.